Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, unfortunately, even though I'm a little bit late to the party, at least with reporting this immediately, or at least talking about this conversation, I thought that I would still put my perspective out there because, of course, for those of you that have most recently watched this most recent NBA season, there was a great amount of history that was accomplished this season, at least, especially with that of the Denver Nuggets. And for those of you, of course, that did not end up seeing the series, for those of you, of course, that did not end up hearing the news, the Denver Nuggets were able to appear in their first NBA Finals appearance, and they were able to pretty much dominate, at least mainly that of the Miami Heat. Not saying that the games were not somewhat relatively close at times, but it was just obvious from the get go, and that's why I predicted the Denver Nuggets to win that within 6 games. Of course, the Denver Nuggets won within about five, but it was very obvious from the get go that the Denver Nuggets were just a more talented team. And I think that Miami, excuse me, that they had pretty good depth. Of course, they had players like that of Duncan Robinson, Max Strus, I believe, Caleb Martin, and a certain amount of other very good role players, some other ones that I may not even be mentioning. But there was no player on that team that had a star or a transcendent star like that of a Nikola Jokic. And that is the main reason why the Denver Nuggets ended up winning that of this series. And this series and this NBA championship was very big for Mr. Jokic's career. And the main reason for that being is because just like eventually with certain guys that don't win a championship after a while, the narrative will eventually start to turn. And Nikola Jokic, of course, for the majority of the season, was the favorite to win the main MVP. And there really was a lot of guys, in my view, on the hot seat this year. And that's why this NBA season was so particularly entertaining, at least for me, because you had Kawhi Leonard with that of the LA Clippers, who, in my view, at least had to make a run for a championship this year with the LA Clippers. And of course, he has been massively disappointing with his tenure with the LA Clippers. He overall has been pretty much disappointing, and he has been a little bit on the hot seat. And now the mainstream media is starting to criticize him more and more each year. Each and every time the Clippers fall out of the playoffs, Kevin Durant, even though, of course, he's a two-time former champion and a two-time former Finals MVP, now that Stephen Curry had won his fourth NBA championship and a Finals MVP and the second NBA championship without that of Kevin Durant, and the fact that Kevin Durant has not won one without Stephen Curry, people view that duo and that little dynasty that they had down there in Golden State completely different than what they did just a few years ago. And even Giannis Antetokounmpo probably had a little bit of heat on him to maybe defend that or lay down the law in that of the East to maybe make it to the NBA Finals. But I think that the two players out of any other players this regular season and in the postseason that probably had the most pressure on them to win a championship this year was probably Joel Embiid of the Philadelphia 76ers and Nikola Jokic of that of the Denver Nuggets. And the reason for that being is because Joel Embiid had never even made a conference finals before, and that was at the very least what he was supposed to do in this postseason run. As we all know, Joel Embiid failed in that endeavor, but we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But Nikola Jokic, basically the standards for him was to at least make the NBA Finals. And of course, many people wanted and believed that Jokic deserved to win the MVP. I probably personally would have voted for him as well. But I don't really have a problem with, Joel Embiid getting the MVP because both of their statistics were pretty phenomenal for the regular season. Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic's record, they were both, pretty close. And Nikola Jokic, he was injured for those last couple of weeks, I believe, or that last week. And that probably is debatably what cost him the MVP. Now, do I also believe that the narrative spread by that of Kendrick Perkins or other former NBA players or media members, do I think that that probably helped out Joel Embiid a little bit? Yeah, personally, I do. Because I think a certain amount of the NBA players or a certain amount of black media members, not just black media members, but, a lot of them were basically taking a look at Nikola Jokic and they were saying, is this dude really as good as what a lot of people are truly saying that he is? Or are they basically just trying to shove this European Caucasian white boy down our throats, the same way that they were trying to do to Steve Nash and Jerry West? Are they basically trying to protect him because he has the complexion for the protection? He's never had the leading record in the NBA. He's made the Western Conference Finals only one time, and it doesn't seem like he's getting the same criticism as other players who have a certain amount of pressures on them. And on the surface, that does sound, certain valid points there. But with the point that Kendrick Perkins, for example, brought up, like in the mid-season, and I made a video earlier on about this. Unfortunately, I believe that I had to delete it because of uploading issues. But Kendrick Perkins, earlier on in the year, excuse me, where he brought up the point that Nikola Jokic, that he was not getting criticized the same way for quote-unquote stat padding, the same way that Russell Westbrook and other players like James Harden and LeBron James were. What people don't understand is that Nikola Jokic, he's not really what I would call a quote-unquote stat padder. Now, that doesn't mean that at times that he's not trying to get a triple-double, or that doesn't mean that he doesn't stat pad to a degree, or that the stats don't matter to him. But to call him in the same realm as that of a Russell Westbrook or a James Harden, or even to a degree for how great he is, a LeBron James, it just wouldn't be the correct assertion. And the reason why that is because Nikola Jokic can play in a system where the ball does not completely revolve around him. When you talk about Russell Westbrook, when you talk about James Harden and LeBron James, Luka Doncic, all those guys play in a system to where the ball and the system is completely revolving around them. So a lot of the times the ball is basically in their hands 24/7. And that's a big part of the reason why every single one of those players that I just mentioned, they usually are not as successful as what they need to be. Even LeBron James to a certain degree. That's a big part of the reason why he is 4-6 in that of the NBA Finals. Nikola Jokic is a guy that can pretty much almost average, 50, 40, 90 when it comes down to it, because that's the level of shooter that he is, while also averaging a triple-double, while inflicting the most positive effect on his teammates. And that is truly what makes Nikola Jokic a truly special player. And against Joel Embiid and against some of those other players that he was in comparison with, but especially Joel Embiid, he of course lost the battle, as they so call it, but in the end, he ended up winning the war, because Nikola Jokic showed everybody that not only was he clearly better than Joel Embiid, and not only was he a championship caliber level player, but that right now he probably is the number one player in the league, and you would now have to call him an all-time great player. No doubt about it, at least in my personal view. Now, the big question is with this segment is that where does Nikola Jokic rank within that of the all-time greats? And that really is the big question of the matter. Where does he rank in terms of the all-time greats? Is he top 10 of all time? Is he top 20 of all time? Top 30? Top 50? Where does he necessarily rank? But we're going to talk about that, here in a minute. Max Kellerman, Keyshawn Johnson, I believe, is his name, and Jay Will, or Jason Williams, I believe, they have a little show. And this was a very interesting segment where they talk about Nikola Jokic's most recent all-time great playoff run and finals run, and where they believe he ranks within the history of basketball in the NBA. They're also going to compare him to that of Giannis Antetokounmpo, which is a very fair comparison because both of those guys are part of this new generation, and they now both have a very similar resume. Both are two former MVPs, both have a Finals MVP and an NBA championship. Of course, Giannis also has a Defensive Player of the Year award. But anyways, just moving further on with it, they're going to be talking about Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and some of the other players as well. They brought up some points that I thought were very interesting. And they're also going to be talking about the all-time list. And they're going to be sharing, at least Max Kellerman is going to be sharing, his all-time list and where he ranks certain players. And I thought that this would also give me an opportunity to talk about where I also rank those all-time great players and what I agree or disagree with about this list. But let's get into it.
So you can hear everything before you attack.
Jump me.
Just let him
Your
finish.
career scoring average.
Oh my goodness.
Seemed to me to be right.
No, wait, look, though.
Let him take it away,
be
Key. Go
completely wrong, and you may be right, but you got to let him
Okay,
finish
go ahead.
so we can get him.
Point taken. Point taken.
Yeah.
I mean, one NBA champion, one NBA Finals MVP, two regular season MVPs, averaged 30, 14, and 10 in the postseason on 55, 46, and 80% from the field. Beat KD and Booker in 6, beat LeBron and AD in 4, beat playoff Jimmy in 5, most playoff triple doubles ever, most assists ever by a center, first 30, 20, and 10 finals game, and a finals MVP.
Now, I call
Absolutely one of the greatest and most dominant playoff runs ever. It might be up there in terms of almost top 5 in terms of playoff runs in NBA history. It was that dominant. And, Nikola Jokic, man, he's just a player that he's really a fantastic player because he can pretty much do anything out there on the court. And many people, of course, have called him that he is the debatable best big man of all time. I don't think that anyone would really call him the greatest big man of all time because greatest would indicate that you have the accomplishments. And in my view, the thing that Nikola Jokic is mainly missing is that he does not have the level of championships that some of those other guys have, like an Akeem Olajuwon or a Shaquille O'Neal. And especially, of course, Bill Russell played in a completely different era. But even if you wanted to give him half credit for those championships, he would have about 5.5, I believe, or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So Nikola Jokic, if he is going to be remembered as the greatest center of all time, he's probably going to have to at least get within that 4 to 5 rings category, probably around that 5 rings category, in my personal view. So we'll see, where that goes from here. But in terms of the most skilled big man of all time, just talking about a center, but even certain power forwards, yeah, Nikola Jokic is up there. His shooting is absolutely fantastic from three-point range, mid-range, up close, layups. He has great interior post moves. He is an excellent passer, probably the greatest passing big man, at least in that I've ever seen in my personal era of watching basketball. When we talk about defense, he's not the most phenomenal defender or phenomenal athlete, but he's a good enough athlete and he's a good enough defender to where he's not a liability on the defensive end. He can be a decent rim protector. He's not a fantabulous one. He's not, fabulous at it like a Giannis Antetokounmpo or a Joel Embiid, but he does his job well enough. There were certain times in the finals where Bam Adebayo, who was clearly their best player, and that's another thing about Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler, in my view, I've just never really been sold on this narrative that Jimmy Butler is a big super duper star. I've just never really been sold on it. And Jimmy Butler, in my view, is a very good player, but I don't think that he's ever going to be a guy that is ever going to lead you to a championship as the number one guy. I think that if Eric Spoelstra is going to win with that team, he's going to have to bring in some real star power. But, we'll see. I don't know. But Jimmy Butler, I think, pretty much proved me right with that assertion because he really was not that great in the NBA Finals. When you really take a look at his numbers, I would have to take a look at his all-around statistics, but he was really struggling in that series. And I don't think that it had to deal with effort. I don't think that it had to do with try or grit. Jimmy Butler has shown that he has all those things, all those qualities with spades, spades of that. But the thing that Jimmy Butler really does not have is A+ level talent. He has just never had it. He still could debatably be an A-grade player, but is he ever going to be a Nikola Jokic? Is he ever going to be a Steph Curry, a Kevin Durant, a Kawhi Leonard, a LeBron James? I just don't ever see it. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not quite sure if he's even on the same level as a Joel Embiid or an AD when he was at his peak, a James Harden, because Jimmy Butler, I don't think that he's ever even been in the conversation as winning a regular season MVP. Now, of course, he does decently well in the playoffs, but I do have to wonder, if not for Eric Spoelstra, could you really take another team to the NBA Finals without the level of coaching that Eric Spoelstra really brings to the table? I'm not so sure about that.
Close my eyes when you
I want to set the table like that for you, but then you.
Well, no, but
But just to talk about Nikola Jokic, if we're really going to compare him to any player, the player that he really reminds me of the most is Larry Bird. And of course, for those of you that were around Larry Bird's era, and I was not personally, but I've watched a lot of tapes about Larry Bird, and I've seen a lot of games on certain clips of him. Larry Bird was a dude that pretty much could do everything. Like a lot of people, when they take a look at Larry Bird today, they're like, oh, he couldn't play in today's NBA and all sort of stuff. Larry Bird was basically the 80s version of Nikola Jokic, but possibly even better. Larry Bird could pretty much do everything that Nikola Jokic could do. He was a very clutch shooter. He was a great mid-range shooter, a great three-point shooter. He was an excellent passer, just like Nikola Jokic. He was an excellent rebounder. And a lot like Nikola Jokic, the only thing that he really didn't max out on was one-on-one defense. Even though he wasn't bad defensively, I believe that he won defensive win shares in the league about 3 or 4 times when it came down to it as a player. When it came down to it. And then I think the only other thing that he didn't really max out on was athleticism, even though he wasn't a bad athlete. But, Nikola Jokic, he reminds me a lot of Larry Bird. A lot of people tried to compare Luka Doncic to that of Larry Bird. Really the only thing that I think that you can compare Luka and Larry Bird with is their skin complexion. That's really about it. I think, and don't get me wrong, Luka, he has ice in his veins, as they so call it. He can be a very decent shooter, but at times he also can struggle. Luka Doncic reminds me a little bit more of either the James Harden or LeBron James type, more the LeBron James type, even though he shoots the threes and shoots more long-range shots than what LeBron James probably on average does, at least from what I see. But Luka Doncic reminds me a lot of LeBron James. He has a very complete and a versatile skill set, but he's very ball dominant. And in my opinion, Luka Doncic, he is eventually going to have to kind of adapt to the teammates around him and adapt in a different type of system. He might get away if he keeps playing with that style. He might get away with 1 or 2 championships. But, of course, we all know Luka Doncic. For those of you that know Luka, he took after LeBron James. LeBron James was his favorite player growing up. And you can see it in a lot of his game because he plays in that exact same system as LeBron James does.
I think the scoring average for his career is like
I closed my eyes when you were saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Just to hear you. Man, that's the best player in the world.
Yeah, he's
the best player in the game.
That's the best.
Nikola Jokic undoubtedly right now has to be the number 1 player. Certain people right now would debate Giannis Antetokounmpo. I could maybe see an argument, but the way that he's went out in the playoffs the last couple of times, I just don't think that I can really put him there. Now, of course, he did have a back contusion, a back injury, I believe, in the Miami Heat series, and he was out for 2 games. That's understandable. I get it. But even when he was in those games, and let me state this, Giannis has showed in the past that he can be somewhat limited. And I don't think that there's any debate about it. When you compare the skill set of Nikola Jokic versus Giannis Antetokounmpo, there's no doubt about who is more skilled. Nikola Jokic is probably a few levels above Giannis Antetokounmpo in terms of skill. And I don't think that Giannis Antetokounmpo is very bad at all in terms of skill. But he pretty much is the modern-day Shaquille O'Neal. He's going to pretty much bully you to the basket and try to get you with certain post moves, and he's going to try to bully you on the inside. Now, he can shoot better than what Shaq ever did in the mid-range and in the long range because they work on that more today. But when you talk about Nikola Jokic, he's pretty much the modern-day Larry Bird. That's what he is.
That's
Best player in the game right now.
Now, the thing that Giannis does beat over on Nikola Jokic in is, of course, defense. He was able to win a Defensive Player of the Year award. But right now, they're both in the same category. But right now, you would have to call Nikola Jokic the best player on the planet. After a finals win, a finals MVP, the dominant playoff runs, the 2 regular season MVPs. And let me state this. Right now, Nikola Jokic, just the way that he's looking, he would probably have to be my favorite for winning MVP next season. I mean, I just don't know a team in the West unless the Golden State Warriors make some serious moves, or maybe the Phoenix Suns, maybe they catch lightning in the bottle. I just don't really know any team in the West that is truly going to threaten them. And now a lot of the narratives that certain media members were making about Jokic, a lot of that shit now is going to go out the window now that he won an NBA championship. So it's going to be a lot easier for him to possibly win an MVP if he has the same results next year, or at least gets them to the number 1 seed. Right now, he would probably be my favorite to win the MVP next year.
He makes everyone around him better. So here's how I would put that in. And by the way,
I agree. Nikola Jokic does make everyone around him better. And a lot of people, when they take a look at someone who averages a triple-double, they always love to say that that player makes someone better. That's not always true. Certain players like a Russell Westbrook or a LeBron James, they don't actually always make the players around them better. They make the team around them better because of what they can bring to the table in terms of their individual talent. But once again, Nikola Jokic, the difference between his triple-doubles and some of those other guys' triple-doubles, and it's not like he's the only one that's ever averaged legitimate triple-doubles in the history of the NBA, But at the end of the day, a lot of the guys who average triple doubles today, they're not really that legitimate of triple doubles. It's because they pretty much play in a system to where the ball is completely catered around them.
Highest PER, for what that's worth, all time in a single season belongs to Jokic. And this year he had another top 15 all time PER season. The quality of his prime is outstanding. Okay. MJ, LeBron, Kareem, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain. Those 5 guys at one point or another, they're.
Golly.
Skin feel tight and dry? Try Hydro Boost Gel Cleanser to cleanse and hydrate. Neutrogena.
One point or another, there was wide-ranging, or at least a large minority of the population, like large, that thought that's the best player ever. Magic, Kobe.
When I take a look at these buckets, when I just take a look at bucket 1, for example, just my personal view of it, and I understand Max Kellerman's point that basically a lot of these guys, or these guys in the first bucket, many people would debate back then or even to this day that these guys are the greatest NBA players of all time, that they have a true debate as the GOAT of their particular sport. But in my view, there really only is 3 out of 5 of those guys that really truly deserve to be at that first table or at that first category. That's Michael Jordan, that's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and that's Bill Russell. Those are really the only 3 guys, in my view, that deserve to be, at least as of yet, at that first table. When you talk about LeBron James, I think LeBron James is an all-time great player, but I think that he's in a tier just below. And of course, a lot of people would say, well, take a look at the statistics, take a look at the longevity and all this sort of stuff. What LeBron James really has on his side in terms of the debatable GOAT debate, and the only thing that he really has, in my view, is the accumulative stats that he's been able to do because of the longevity, and also a certain amount of the other stats that he has because of the way that he plays. It's almost kind of like Drew Brees and that of the NFL. Many people take a look at Drew Brees and take a look at how many 5,000 passing yard seasons he has, and they're like, wow, Drew Brees must be debatably the greatest quarterback of all time because he has like 5,000 passing yard seasons. No one else is even close to that. But when you really take a look at the type of system that was catered around Drew Brees, with as many screens and as many short passes overall, that system, pretty much accumulated. And don't get me wrong, Drew Brees was an all-time great quarterback, in my view, top 10 of all time for his position. But Drew Brees was never truly the greatest quarterback of all time. And a certain amount of those statistics was really because of the way that the offense was catered around him. And LeBron, in my view, is a decent amount more talented for his position or for his sport than what Drew Brees ever was for his, because LeBron James at one point in time for damn near a decade was thought of as the best and the most talented all-around player, and debatably the most valuable all-around player, maybe with Stephen Curry, in my view, challenging his mantle throughout the 2010s, and maybe KD, as certain people would say, but in my view, more of Steph Curry, because he was always the bus driver of that team. But anyways, neither here nor there at the moment. But anyways, LeBron James, certainly more talented for his profession than that of Drew Brees. But LeBron James, once again, a lot of his statistics comes from the fact that he chooses a lot of his rosters and he chooses the way that he plays, which is in a very ball-dominant system. And a certain amount of other players have also played in that type of system as well within the past decades. And that's why you're seeing more triple-doubles today than what you usually ever did 20, 30 years ago. That's why Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, and a lot of these other players, and also just because the pace is faster today. More points are being scored today than what there was in the early 2000s and also that of the 90s. Now maybe in the 80s, I believe that there were similar points to this, but that's why you see so many more triple doubles today, because the pace is a lot faster. When you talk about the 90s, there would be certain games that would be ended in the 70s to 90s in terms of points. It just is what it is. So once again, we have to be very careful in terms of these statistics. And I understand Max Kellerman's point about LeBron James, many people debating him as the greatest. But for anyone who truly knows anything about basketball, he's really not the greatest player of all time. He's a league below. He's still an all-time great player. And Wilt Chamberlain, the same thing. Wilt Chamberlain is a great player. But for him being as physically dominant as what he was, he should have more than just 2 NBA championships. No doubt about it. And the same thing with LeBron James. There's a reason why he is 4-6 in the NBA Finals. I have never really seen him in the same league as Michael Jordan and some of those other guys. But however, I do think he's in the same league as Will Chamberlain, Larry Bird, Tim Duncan, and maybe one other player that I'm not mentioning. But in my view, you take LeBron James, Larry Bird, Will Chamberlain, Tim Duncan, you put all four of those players in a hat, whoever you rank from that of 5 to 8, is whoever you rank.
Bird, Shaq, Steph, all had multiple, usually, MVPs and finals MVPs, and at one point or another were considered the best player in the game. And oftentimes, many of those guys sustained that for a period of several years. I think Tim Duncan probably belongs in that category too. I have him at 11. Hakeem.
That really, in my view, is probably the biggest problem that I would have with this list right here, which is that Tim Duncan would be at number 11. I always talk about Tim Duncan whenever it comes to my NBA videos, because a lot of people really don't realize what Tim Duncan actually brought to the table. Many people, in my view, kind of disrespect him in certain rankings. He is undoubtedly the most underrated top 10 player of all time. And I say top 10 player because I just don't see how you could have him any lower. I've heard certain people try to debate Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant and Hakeem Olajuwon over Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan, once again, in my view, is in that same ranking as Larry Bird, LeBron James, and Will Chamberlain. Now, was he ever as physically spectacular as any of those players, or did he ever look as physically dominant as any of those players? No, but one thing Tim Duncan brought to the table was a great amount of impact, and overall, he was extraordinarily consistent. When you had Tim Duncan, you knew that you were getting consistency on both ends of the floor for a great majority of his career. So Tim Duncan, in my view, was a vastly underrated top 10 player. And when you really talk about his impact, like a lot of people when it comes to LeBron James, for example, people love to always say how LeBron James, how he never had any help and all this other stuff, which really is a lie. But, that's neither here nor there for the conversation. When you take a look at Tim Duncan, you should take a look at some of the teams that he had to drag to the NBA Finals in the early 2000s. Like there was one year, I think in the 2003 year, where David Robinson was completely washed. He was averaging, I believe, about 11 points per game, nowhere near the same player that he had been, when it came down to it. And then I think the second best player was either Tony Parker or Steven Jackson or some shit like that. And Tim Duncan was able to win with that team in the 2003 NBA playoffs. A lot of people truly don't realize how impactful Tim Duncan actually was. He was a great value piece that pretty much set the culture for a franchise that had never made an NBA Finals appearance without him and never made one after him.
Moses and KD, you can say the same thing about the guys I said before them. I would have them a tick below the other guys, but okay, that could be debated. But I think those 14 are cemented. And then the question is, who's 15? KG?
Two other spots that I would like to talk about on this list as well. Kobe Bryant and Kevin Durant. Kobe Bryant, in my view, even for as great of a player as he was, I don't think that Kobe Bryant is as definitive of a top 10 player as what a Tim Duncan or a LeBron James would be. Because at least both of those players I for sure would have on a second Mount Rushmore, or I would have within my top 10. Kobe Bryant is in that same category, in my view, with Hakeem Olajuwon, however you pronounce it, and Stephen Curry, to where, you could put him in the top 10, but they could also fall right outside. And the reason why that is, no disrespect to Kobe Bryant, but 3 of those championships that he has, he clearly was not the main guy. He clearly was not the main bus driver of that team. It clearly was Shaquille O'Neal, no doubt about it. And then when you talk about, his statistics and when you talk about his accomplishments, he only has 1 regular season MVP. And Kobe Bryant, even for how great of a player that he was and how decently skilled that he was, Kobe Bryant was not the most efficient player. I believe for an average of his career, and understandably he was a shooting guard, that's understandable, but I believe he shot an average of 46% for his career, somewhere around there. So Kobe Bryant, in my view, he would probably be anywhere from 10 to 12. I have him in that same ranking as Steph Curry and Hakeem Olajuwon. And in my personal view, I would probably put Curry above both of those players. A lot of people would heavily disagree with that, But when you talk about the level of impact that Steph Curry has, Steph Curry undoubtedly, in my view, is more impactful than either of those players. He just is. You can have a legitimate debate that Steph Curry is actually the most impactful offensive player ever.
Was maybe not ever the best player in the world, but close to.
And Kevin Durant, just to talk about him really quickly, I don't really have a huge problem with him being a number 14. I don't think that I would quite put him there. And the reason why I say that is because the 2 championships that he has, I'm not going to say that they have an asterisk next to them, but when you clearly eventually are found out as the guy that is not the main bus driver, and you have really no final success whatsoever without that of the main player, Stephen Curry, I just don't know if I can really put you within my top 15. And really, to be quite honest with you, Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo, they've really already caught up with that of Kevin Durant, even though Kevin Durant has 2 Finals MVPs and 2 championships. Because those 2 championships, in my opinion, they probably really equal out to about 1.
And a great player who was the best player in a championship team. Oscar Robertson was the standard at point guard for years, really before Magic Johnson. Jerry West was an all-time great. Same thing with Elgin Baylor, though he never won a title. Dr. J's best work took place in the ABA, but super great player. Dirk Nowitzki was the best player in the game, probably for a year. Isaiah Thomas, back-to-back titles. And among the great all-time point guards, Giannis has a similar resume to Joker, actually, and David Robinson.
In my view, Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo, they pretty much have to be in that same category with Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Garnett, maybe other players within that top 20 range. I'm trying to think maybe who else might be there. Kevin Durant, certain players like that. Possibly a Dwayne Wade, possibly if you wanted to put him up there. But I would probably put some of those other players even above a Dwayne Wade for how great that he actually was. Nikola Jokic is right there with all those players. He is right there with them in my view. He's right there with Giannis. He's right there with KD. He's right there with Kevin Garnett. He's right there with Dirk Nowitzki. He's right there with all those guys. And when we talk about the other players that never won championships but were great players, like that of Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, maybe a Clyde Drexler, certain guys like that, Elgin Baylor, you could have a serious debate that Nikola Jokic is above most of those guys. He certainly is above Charles Barkley and, in my view, Karl Malone. Just my personal view of it. And even as a Elgin Baylor, I would probably put him above Elgin Baylor. Just because Elgin Baylor, for how phenomenal he was, he still was never able to win an NBA championship.
Won an MVP, won a finals. He won two chips. Two chips. One
99 and 2003.
Yep. So.
And that last player that they were talking about, David Robinson, that probably also is another little issue that I would have with this list, because I just don't see how David Robinson would make that list. And there's no offense against him. At times he can be a very underrated player. But for you to be debatably within the top 20 of all time, or even the top 30, you have to have led your team at least to a finals appearance, in my view, or at least to a conference finals more than likely a multitude of times. David Robinson, the most biggest accomplishment in his career was leading his team to the Western Conference Finals in 1995 and then basically getting punked repeatedly by that of Hakeem Olajuwon. The man never won a championship without that of Tim Duncan as the main guy. So I don't really see how David Robinson is in the same league as any of those guys, although he was a great player.
The question is, those are the candidates along with Joker, in my mind, for that 15th slot. And I could tell you, just looking at it, I'm taking the Joker, given how much better he makes the people around him, given what he just did in these playoffs to win finals MVP, but really playoff MVP, given his back-to-back MVPs in the regular season that could have easily been 3 in a row, which almost no one's ever done. I'm taking him over Isaiah, Dirk.
Can't do it over Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Yeah, I personally would not take him over Isaiah Thomas either. Now, of course, Isaiah Thomas never won a regular season MVP, and he probably was not looked at as dominant in the playoffs. But like I said, sometimes statistics don't tell the whole story. Isaiah Thomas was the main bus driver. He was the main benefactor of that Detroit Pistons team, or he was the main factor to why they were winning. And let's keep in mind, he beat Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and a multitude of other great players, Clyde Drexler, throughout that playoff run, but especially Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and Magic Johnson, 3 mega champions. Of course, Michael Jordan would have not been a champion yet, but he still defeated him throughout the playoffs.
Thomas was never considered the best player in basketball.
Isaiah Thomas won MVPs. He's won 3.
No, regular season?
Yes.
Isaiah Thomas won regular season
84
MVP?
No, Isaiah Thomas never won any regular season MVPs, but I do believe he won one All-Star MVP. But anyways, these guys are kind of going into a ramble, so I'm going to split this video up into a part 2, and then we're going to continue onwards, and then let's see what they have to say heading into it. And then the next part of the conversation should be about Nikola Jokic versus Giannis Antetokounmpo. Okay, so in this second part here, they're then going to continue the conversation with Jokic versus Giannis Antetokounmpo. And conversation should be a bit interesting. Let's see what they have to say.
Position that Jokic is in now, perceived as the best player in the game, multiple MVP, so much better than everyone else in the playoffs, right?
Let me ask you this, though, Max.
Yeah.
So he needs to be right underneath Giannis then, correct?
But that's the question. That's, to me,
Because he can't.
I'm not really quite sure if he's right underneath Giannis, because that's a really great debate. The only thing that really separates Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo is that Giannis has a Defensive Player of the Year award. So if you had Giannis above Nikola Jokic, I don't really have a problem with it. But really that conversation is a coin toss. But the thing that separates the both of them is that Nikola Jokic is clearly the more versatile offensive player, while Giannis Antetokounmpo is clearly the more versatile defensive player. But when you talk about in terms of the offensive skill set, Nikola Jokic is clearly debatably the most skilled for his position, really almost out of anyone in NBA history. When you talk about Giannis, and he's up there in terms of defense, but offensively, you could argue that he's a bit more limited. But defensive-wise, of course, also does matter. But that argument is really a coin toss.
It's the same. If you're telling me 2 MVPs and a championship, let's just leave it there.
Like I said, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Nikola Jokic, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, and KD, all those players, in my view, are in the same ranking.
Yep.
Let's not get into the points
And maybe Dwight Wade.
this and that and blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. Let's just leave it right there.
I totally agree. Those are the candidates for 15 to me. It's Giannis and Joker. Both have at one time or another been perceived as the best player in the game. Both have multiple regular season MVPs. Both have finals MVPs. Both put up stupid numbers in the regular season and had great postseasons, right?
Hey,
It comes
Jay.
down to Giannis or Joker for the 15th slot.
Let
All
me
time.
ask you this, Jay. Who's a harder player to defend, though?
I don't even know how to answer that.
Well, in my view, if we are going to objectively answer that, I don't think that there's ever a way that you can completely stop both players, as there's not going to be a way that you can stop an all-time great player. And both Giannis and Jokic are all-time great players. But I think that the answer would be obviously clear. And that does have to be Nikola Jokic. Nikola Jokic would have to be the harder player to guard. I have seen certain series where Giannis has been severely limited, by that of Kawhi Leonard or by that of the Miami Heat. And he has been limited, even though his stat line would probably be good compared to his, but not great compared to his usual standards. Nikola Jokic, almost no matter what team that I've seen him up against, there's just really no way that you can guard him. He just has too much of a versatile offensive skill set. Like I said, he can shoot from basically anywhere. He has great post moves when it comes down to it. He can pass, he can rebound. Nikola Jokic, I would probably have to say, is the harder player to guard.
Because they both do things very differently. Like they're 2 different players.
So let me rephrase the question.
Mm-hmm.
Who would you rather have on your team, and not recency bias? I'm just talking about from what you know as an ex-basketball player, Naismith winner, second pick of the Chicago Bulls, all that. From what you know, who would you rather have?
I mean, as a guard, my dream would have Nikola Jokic.
I also would have to agree with that. I probably would also pick Nikola Jokic. And, it's definitely a debate. But I think the thing that separates Nikola Jokic and Giannis, especially if you're picking between those two, is that Nikola Jokic, that his offensive skill set is really just off the charts. Like I said, he can really do everything, and not even just from scoring. He can pass extraordinarily well, almost just as well as anybody else in the league. He might even be the best passer at the current moment in time in the whole entire league. On top of that, he can rebound extraordinarily well. He has great post moves. He can shoot from anywhere. He's great from the free throw line. There's just really no weakness in Nikola Jokic's game. At least when you talk about the offense. Now, defense, of course, he's not a transcendent athlete. And on top of that, he's not the greatest rim protector, but he's not bad either. So I think that he gives you enough try and enough grit on the defensive end. And then on top of that, when you talk about the offense, there's just no limitations that he has. Giannis has been shown in the past that he can be somewhat stopped, that he can be somewhat limited. So I would have to pick Nikola Jokic.
I mean, I play very similarly to Jamal Murray, right? So having a guy that I can come off any pick and roll, I mean, I had one of the best weapons in all college basketball in Shane Battier, and that dude is way different than Shane Battier, and we dominated college basketball in a pick and roll perspective.
Do you like Jokic's shooting from the outside and
it.
playmaking or Giannis's defense? That's what it really, in a comparison to those.
I pretty much would agree. It pretty much is Jokic's all-around offensive game. The only way that Giannis really even wins that debate is if you include the defense. And Giannis very clearly is the better defensive player. But I think that offensively wise, Jokic is really just so far apart from Giannis, in my view, just of his all-around versatile skill set. Now, of course, Anthony Davis, when we talk about him, who probably was one of the more overrated players of the 2010s in terms of his value, because he never brought the New Orleans Pelicans to shit in terms of playoff success. But when it came down to it, Anthony Davis, of course, he probably at his best has an all-around more versatile skill set than that of Giannis. But it doesn't really matter because Anthony Davis can't lead a team anywhere. The difference is that Nikola Jokic can actually lead a team to an NBA championship. So in my view, I probably would pick Nikola Jokic. But if you were to pick Giannis Antetokounmpo, I couldn't be mad at it.
Two players. Giannis is more of a rim protector and a better defender overall. Joker's obviously a better shooter from the outside and a better playmaker
I hate answering
with the
this
ball.
question for anybody that just says.
Well, Nikola Jokic is a better shooter from every range. The only range that Giannis might be a better shooter from is maybe about 2 feet from the basket.
It's one or the other.
And of course, that's talking about dunks and layups.
I would start to question your basketball acumen, right? Because how's my roster constructed?
Right.
Like,
Sure.
what pieces do I have?
So, in other words, it's that close between Giannis and the Joker.
I think as it relates to their dominance and how they impact the game, yes.
Stop.
So if you had to pick one at 15.
I said I would pick
All right.
Joker.
So by the way, I just want to point out, guys, he won Finals MVP, and my claim that he's in the 12 to 15 conversation, but certainly top 20, doesn't sound so ridiculous anymore, right? Like, he's right there. You might have him 21.
I don't think it's ridiculous at all. And like I said, if Nikola Jokic was going to win this championship, which is exactly what he did, then he was going to be up there with anybody. And yes, he is up there now with Kevin Garnett. He is up there with Dirk Nowitzki. He is up there with Kevin Durant, Giannis Antetokounmpo. All those players, and maybe Dwayne Wade, like I said, all those players, in my view, would be within the same ranking.
Have him 15, whatever. But he's
that top 25 to top 30 ranking.
Floating in that range right now already. Not just centers, like any position. Are the Nuggets headed for a dynasty?
Uh-oh.
We'll see about that. That's going to be very interesting because I believe that they might have to add a little bit more pieces just to pretty much contain that, but we'll see.
After Jay has this from FanDuel.
Uh-oh. Yes, Jay. Yeah, Jay, it's, Isaiah Thomas, man.
I'm going to let Jay, remember what you said? Here's my technique. I'm listening.
Jay will have FanDuel when we come back from break.
Key, it works. You're right. KJM.
If you just listen.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it for the video. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. Nikola Jokic, of course, accomplished a great amount of history. And if we're asking the question, is Nikola Jokic a top 10 player? I would not quite put him top 10. I think he's going to have to win more NBA championships. But top 20, yeah, I could clearly see that. Certainly top 30. No doubt about it. Like I said, he's in that same ranking with Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Durant, and maybe a couple of other players. Dwayne Wade, he's in that same area. So no doubt about it. But congratulations to Mr. Nikola Jokic for now becoming one of the all-time great NBA players. And, of course, proving that he was a championship caliber player all along and proving the narratives about him throughout the season incorrect. So congratulations to him and that of the Denver Nuggets. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see what ends up happening, if there's any more good debates, and we'll also see where the Denver Nuggets go from here. But anyways, that's pretty much about it overall, and I'll talk to you all later.